Hello, everyone, and welcome to Talk Nerdy. Today is Monday, July 7th, 2025, and I'm the host of the show, Dr. Cara Santamaria. And as always, before we dive into this week's episode, I want to thank those of you who make Talk Nerdy possible. Remember, this show is and will always be 100% free to download as long as we keep making it. We are on episode 558 now. I think we're 11 years deep, which is amazing. And that is all thanks to the incredible support of folks just like you. If you would like to pledge your support on an episodic basis, all you've got to do is visit patreon.com/talknerdy to learn more. This week's top patrons include Anu Badavaj, Chuck Blell, Daniel Lang, David J.E. Smith, Joseph Lamore, Mary Neva, Brian Holden, David Compton, Gabrielle F. Jaramillo, Joe Wilkinson, Pasquale Gelati, and Ulrika Hagman. Thank you all so much. So this week, I had the opportunity to chat with author Anika Burgess. She is a photo editor and a writer. She's actually a freelance contributor to the photo department at the New York Times, and she has a brand new book out. It's called Flashes of Brilliance: The Genius of Early Photography and How It Transformed Art, Science, and History. So without any further ado, here she is, Anika Burgess. Well, Anika, thank you so much for joining me today.
Oh, thank you so much for having me.
Absolutely. I'm super excited to talk to you about your new book, your first book, Flashes of Brilliance: The Genius of Early Photography and How It Transformed Art, Science, and History. And this is really exciting because you are coming at this as a photographer. As you may know, my podcast, which has been around for over a decade now, it started as like a pure science communication podcast. So I would interview either scientists or science writers, science journalists, science communicators. And I always would notice that science journalists and communicators would sort of come from two different camps. You had your scientists who then decided that they wanted to get more involved in SciComm and Journo, and so they would, enter from that sort of field. And then you had your journos who went to J school who just like loved the science beat and would get deeper and deeper into the weeds on that. I cannot imagine how much work it must have been for a photo editor, a freelance photo editor and I'm assuming you also do photography yourself.
I do very casually on my phone, like so many people.
Love it. Okay, great. So a freelance photo editor, but somebody who obviously has a photographer's eye, to then dive deep into the history of photography, which is an area of probably quite a lot of scholarship. Like that must have felt quite daunting.
It certainly did. And, I'm somebody who I studied history at university. I've always loved it. And it was when I started reading more and more about photo history did I realize that it was so rich with stories and individuals. And I just fell deeper and deeper into it. And so it certainly was an education in some respects with science. I didn't study science at university, but by coming into it from an avenue of innovation and art and photography, it sort of made it more understandable and more, I could sort of appreciate what they were trying to do.
Photography is one of these fascinating areas of, well, I can't even finish that sentence right, of blank, of inquiry, of storytelling, of innovation. It's kind of the convergence of exactly what you said: art, science, technology, storytelling, journalism, revolution, activism. Like there's so much kind of contained, but also bursting at the seams of photography that it must be hard to even know where to start.
That is so true, because I think photo history is history. I mean, there's no field of study, there's no discipline that hasn't been impacted by photography and doesn't use photography. I mean, you literally name it: medicine, engineering, anything you can possibly think of has been involved in photography in its history. And so what I found when I was putting the book together was, how can I focus on the areas of innovation in photography? How can I focus on the areas that really changed not only photography, but also that also changed science, or that also changed how we engage with the world?
Right. So as a photo editor, you are seeing images. Maybe you're seeing negatives, maybe you're seeing printed images, maybe you're talking about digital or film or across the board, but you're seeing visual representations of the world that were captured through a series, of glass on emulsions, on things like that. But you're seeing the finished product. How much before you started to dive into the research for this book did you know about the chemistry and the physics and the engineering of photography?
I knew, enough to know how it came together in terms of how the early stages of photography, the sort of invention of the photography in the 1830s. I was familiar with that history, but it was certainly something I dived into much more deeply when I was looking at the innovations that I discuss in Flashes of Brilliance, because the innovations, like I guess still today, changes to the technology drove some of the innovations. So changes to how photographs were produce, changes to the chemicals or the chemistry they used, that also drove some of the innovation changes as well. So the two very much went hand in hand.
Yeah, it reminds me quite a bit of the way that the scientific method and the scientific process moves along. And I think it's sort of sometimes lost in conversation, but so important to highlight that very often when we talk about, let's say, medical advancements in biotechnology or in biomedical science, pharmaceutical science, something like that, we couldn't do certain things until we could figure out how to amplify DNA, right? And then once we got past that step and we're like, oh, now I have a ton of DNA to work with. I can do all this stuff that before I could never do. So many of those inflection points are solving what feel like intractable, but almost simple, but really difficult problems. And the second that those problems are solved, a whole world opens up. And then you just keep seeing this happen.
That's true. And I will say, though, which is detailed in the book, is even though certain things did become much easier once, for example, the dry gelatin process came about in the sort of late 1870s, and prior to that, it was quite complex to make a wet collodion print. People still tried to, bring all their chemicals into a dark room, into a gas balloon to try to get aerial views. People still tried to do
Wow,
things
yeah.
that were really complex and risky in some respects because of this desire to want to be able to photograph something, which is a key part of this, is like, what is this pull and this, in some cases I would say, like borderline obsession with trying to take a photograph of a moment in time.
Oh, for sure. I'm wondering too, this is gonna be a little bit meta, so, I'm skipping, 10 steps ahead just to come back, but there have always been the folks who are, the earliest of adopters, who are like, "There's a new thing, I need to have it, I don't care how much it costs, I'm gonna sell my shoes in order to have it, and I'm gonna try it out, and I'm gonna play with it, upside down and left and right, and be, that person who gets it." And then there's the people who are like, analog is better, who are always like, that new thing, that's not art anymore. They're making it too easy. It's only a real photograph if you're painting the platinum and the palladium on the so
Hmm.
it's like, I'm curious if you saw that all, so sort of all along the way. This is not a new hipster phenomenon, is it? This has always been the case.
Well, yes and no, actually. I'm going to say, so when the dry gelatin process came in, which was much easier, basically meant you no longer had to prepare your plate on the spot in your dark room and expose it in the moment of time. You could have them pre-prepared. You could take them out with you in the field. It was just like much easier, and it made photography much more appealing and kind of exploded it into an amateur pastime.
Oh, so that's a huge inflection
A
point, like
huge
you
inflection
mentioned.
point,
Okay, okay.
massive. And so it changed. And obviously, talk about technology driving change. From that point on, camera design changed, and it became much easier to take small hand cameras, and they were much more convenient to carry around with you. And so it really changed the landscape of who was able to take photos and how. And there were obviously some holdouts. There were certainly some of the old guard that were feeling to themselves that it was not legit. But by and large, it was an absolute wholesale sea change. So I think it may have been true up until that point, but I think from then on, it was just so much more convenient, because prior to
Right.
that point, if wet collodion was the process that really dominated photography for sort of 3 decades, and it was complex.
Yeah, there must be that sort of okay, maybe this is more analog, maybe this is more rich, or maybe this is more, whatever argument somebody's going to make, but also how burdensome. I'm just so over it. I think about people today too. It's like, I have my friends who listen to their vinyl and who have the big setup with all the, amplifiers and everything, but it's not like they're not listening to, Spotify in their car. They're still doing, and I guess I asked this because there was a friend of mine who I was quite close to when I was in college, and I would often woman sit for him. He was a photographer. He was, studying photography. It was like his whole passion. He had a full laboratory like in his apartment. And he would buy those vintage cameras with the bellows, the huge large format cameras with the plates in the back, and he painted platinum and palladium on watercolor paper, and he did all the printing himself. And it was a huge pain in the ass. Like, I would have to sit for like a whole minute, to get like really still so that he could get the photo but there was a richness and a kind of retro feel to the work he did. But of course, he also took pictures on his phone.
That's right. Yeah. And I think too the field that I go into in the book, where there was certainly a tension between what had come before, mostly, drawing, illustrations, painting, and photography, is in the area of medicine, basically medical photography, or specifically
Oh.
photomicrography, so photographs through a microscope. Because, when you think about it, a black and white photograph through a microscope does not give you a lot of context. It does not give you a lot of information. It can be really hard to discern what you're actually looking at if you don't have the color. And so it was a long time with photomicrography, photographs through a microscope, that before there was, sort of this like wholesale understanding that it had a huge amount of value to have a photograph of something through a
Interesting. So,
microscope.
yeah, so people are like, no, if I draw it, it actually, and even to this day, that's still kind of,
Yes.
don't get me wrong, like electron micrography, things that have changed like the game completely. But there are medical illustrations that you just can't photograph only the vasculature of somebody's body. But
Yep.
if you can
Exactly.
draw
Yeah.
it, then you really can see, blood flow.
Certainly. I mean, Gray's Anatomy still has a lot of illustrations in it, for this
Yeah,
very
yeah,
same
yeah.
reason. So there's certainly this sort of tension between what was more valuable to medicine. Was it illustrations and drawings, or was it photography? Which sort of goes to your point, I think, about the sort of holdouts. Is just like how much benefit is photography actually adding to this field at this particular moment in time?
Oh, and I can imagine if I were like a member of a royal, court or something. I was like, I was a member of the monarchy, and I wanted to be like, set for, I wanted to sit for a portrait for forever. A painter can, they can do a few tweaks here and there. Like, we didn't have Photoshop back then, so it's like, oh, you don't get rid of the double chin. You want to, make me look a little taller. Like, you could do that with a painting. That would have been harder to do with photographs back then.
Definitely. And, there I have a chapter on that as well, which is, this idea of what was photographic truth, right? So this idea that the camera is a mechanical device. It works with optics and chemistry, and it's going to just record what is in front of it versus it being used as a tool to create something. And this was where, photo manipulation did start. I mean, it started really early on. And one of the reasons was because portraits were pretty unflattering, or they could be very unflattering. There's great references in old photographic journals, which I pored over and became, really deep in the weeds with, where there was advice about how to retouch somebody to make them look younger, or, to remove the frown lines on their face. I mean, this happened early on because yes, and also because there's a commercial reality, photographers wanted to make sure their customers were happy. And then there were those individuals who wanted to manipulate photos to create a scene, to not just record something, but to create something they wouldn't otherwise be able to capture, which is really, an artistic take on photography. So these tensions, which we think of as very contemporary in terms of photo manipulation, in terms of the limitations of the camera, in terms of like what is photography supposed to be doing, this all was happening in the 1850s, 1840s onwards.
Yeah, I'm actually digging through. I'm just looking at the photographs in the Trick or Truth chapter that you
That's the
write
one,
about
yeah.
all of the interesting kind of techniques that individuals use. And I don't know, I'm thinking of a post that a friend of mine who is he's a director of photography, so more like moving pictures, but he posted a picture. I think he was like somewhere in sub-Saharan Africa, of this like single baobab tree, and he was like with different lenses, and he showed 3 pictures side by side. And in the first one, the tree looked enormous and it was just towering over the landscape. And then the landscape got flatter and flatter and flatter. And eventually the tree just looked really tiny and like inconsequential in this really wide kind of flattened landscape. And it's like, yeah, you manipulate even something as simple as a field of view or an aperture, something like that. And it can really change how we perceive reality.
Absolutely. And there were manuals about this, how to do it for fun, for sort of comic effect, how to, on that point about perspective, I've seen pictures where people position their feet close to the lens so it looked like they had really big shoes.
Yeah.
This, using like comedy, photo manipulation was also definitely happening in the 19th century.
Oh, I love that. And I mean, it happens, obviously, I'm not a photographer by any stretch of the imagination, but it happens to me all the time today because, the selfie is like the dominant form of
Yeah.
photographic evidence now. And you're taking a selfie with somebody and you're like, my arms are too short. The guy with the
Yes.
long arms needs to, my head looks really big. It's twice as big as yours. That's weird.
Yep. Yep. Absolutely. So these certain problems still remain.
So I'm curious, we've thrown around a few terms, so I'm wondering if we could take a step back and talk a little bit about like the earliest of photography, because when I think about the first inflection point, am I wrong? Is like a camera obscura or like a pinhole camera, are these the very earliest things, or did things exist before that?
Yeah, I mean, I think, when you think about photography sort of coming into the world stage, really, the key date is 1839 because it's the date that Daguerre announced the daguerreotype. But obviously, prior to that point, and well, first I should say it took him a long time to get to that point, and
Right, because the
secondly,
daguerreotype is an actual physical photograph. It's a print of
it
something,
is.
right?
It was
Yeah. So
actually it's on metal. It's on
on
copper.
metal, yeah, we think of like now and there's like tin types and there's all the things that came from it, but
Mhm.
that daguerreotype was the first way to go, oh, it's a photograph, whereas before there was photography without the graph part, I guess.
Yeah, I think so. I think really what we're talking about is, and this happens throughout photo history. It kept coming up again and again in my research. Is how often several individuals were coming to an idea at the same time. We saw it with the movies and motion. You see it with photography as well. You have Daguerre and you also have an Englishman called William Henry Fox Talbot, who are both doing very different, but coming to the same idea, which is how can I permanently photograph a scene, capture a scene. But prior to them, you had people like Thomas Wedgwood, who was figuring out that light sensitive chemicals on fabric or on leather and on paper. So all of these sort of ideas had been sort of permutating around in the environment. And then Daguerre was this scene painter in Paris who created these extraordinary illusions with painted sheets and illuminations and light. And it was from there that he had this idea about, well, maybe I could actually try to capture a scene from life using a camera. And he got into a partnership with a man called Nessef von Niepce, and they started figuring out what chemicals do we need? What light sensitive chemicals do we need in order to try to actually photograph from nature? And what's extraordinary is while they're doing this, Talbot starts making his own experiments, and then he sort of stops in the mid 1830s. He just decides he's had some success. He managed to actually capture an image on paper, and then he sort of decides to stop, which is he was obviously busy, but it seems kind of surprising in hindsight. So that when Daguerre announced the daguerreotype in 1839, Talbot was suddenly hustling to get his own invention out there and announce it to the world. But they were completely different. And as you're saying, a daguerreotype it's an item that is on copper, and I have one actually. I bought a daguerreotype because I wanted to hold one because it is a real object, and it's extraordinary to hold it, to know that what I'm holding is what came out of the camera at the time. This is not a print of a negative. This is an actual object. It's an item. It's got weight. It's behind glass. It's really clear. It's really beautiful, and that was what really captured everybody's imagination in 1839. Now, obviously, the daguerreotype changed and evolved, and ultimately was superseded by a bunch of other processes. But it was really, really groundbreaking at the time. And there's reports of English and American visitors going to Paris in 1839 and seeing a daguerreotype and writing to newspapers or writing to their family and saying just how astonishing it was to see this crystal clear vision of the world duplicated exactly on metal behind glass.
Oh, it's incredible. It's almost like, and this is, my brain works in very strange ways because obviously this is a physical process. There's this like deep change. It was a chemical process as well, but there's obviously like so much kind of technology over the next 100 years. But then cut to like these iterative things where now we've got the negatives and then we've got to print the things and we've got to and then back to like instant photography in like the 80s and 90s, and like the Polaroid kind of becoming king, and this idea of, well, I want something that's like exactly right then and right there.
Yes. And I think, and it's so interesting because that sense of anticipation, we just don't have anymore.
Oh yeah, in
And
any field of
this
anything. Yeah,
is true.
exactly. Yeah.
This is true. This is beyond photography. But I mean, and maybe that. I'm sure that's part of the reason why people are loving shooting analog, or people are going back to tintypes of wet collodion process now, because there is a sense of anticipation behind it.
Oh
And
yeah.
I certainly remember that as well. I mean, I remember sending, I have taken photographs. I have loved taking photographs, and I remember sending off film, in the 90s and waiting for it to come back.
Oh yeah, even when we were to the point where you could go to, your local pharmacy, drop it off, and like it was only an hour wait, you were still like, "Ooh, what's it gonna be?" Like, I don't remember. Yeah. I have film in my refrigerator right now. I am not a photographer by any stretch, but I do enjoy medium format toy cameras. Yeah, so I have a lot of like expired 120 film that they don't make anymore, that is precious to me, but periodically I will pull it out and I'll shoot a roll on it. And then it's like I have to mail it off, and I don't know what's on it, and I don't know if they even turned out. I don't know if they're full of light leaks or if I accidentally exposed the whole roll, So it's always exciting.
It is so exciting. And my son just got a Polaroid camera, and he's young, but he finds it fascinating. I think he finds it more fascinating than taking photos with my iPhone, because you get this little physical paper, and it disappears. You have to put it face down and you have to wait for it to appear. There's something so exciting and energizing about that. And I think that, one of the things that I think is sort of pivotal in this book is sort of considering why everybody wanted to do this for such a long time, no matter how difficult it was, or how maybe dangerous some of the chemicals were, or how complex it was. It's just like this desire to capture a moment in time had sort of took hold almost as soon as the daguerreotype was announced, and it's been with us in one degree or another ever since.
Well, and it's probably no coincidence that even though he was a landscape or a landscape artist who then, developed this format for printing, some of the earliest, and I'm guessing your daguerreotype, I could be wrong, but I'm guessing your daguerreotype is actually a portrait. Like some of the earliest versions are
Yeah,
just
that's
people.
right. And that didn't happen immediately, though, because in 1839 the exposure times were still too long. But and this is one of the other central things in Flashes of Brilliance is how much people were pushing to innovate this medium that was already extraordinary. And so the daguerreotypes, when it was announced, there was two things about them that was people were a little bit disappointed by. One being that exposure times were too long for portraits, and two being they weren't in color. And so within very short period of time, people started experimenting with new chemicals and new lenses, and portraiture became possible. And then people started painting on color, using literal oil paints to try to get some of that sort of like life back, because even then people were aware that daguerreotypes could be unflattering. And there's one quote that said something like, some daguerreotype portraits resemble fried fish stuck to a silver platter.
Gross.
So it's not just us that sometimes look at this area of photography and think, gosh, they look super stiff and uncomfortable. Evidently at the time that was also true.
Yeah, I'm sure they felt super stiff and uncomfortable
I'm
while they were
sure.
sitting for those. I mean, and then
Oh,
there's that
yes.
whole tradition of like taking pictures of dead people. And I wonder if, part of that is, okay, we want this like last memory, but they're pretty good, like, at sitting for pictures, right?
The exposure time thing was really fascinating to dig into, actually, because you read different accounts of it. But, broadly speaking, in that first decade, the exposure time changed so much, even just comparing to time of day and time of year. So if you're taking a photo in London summer, in May at 12 noon, it's going to be a much shorter exposure than if it is October and it's 9 a.m. and the sun's only just come up and it's really smoggy because London was so industrial. So there are these huge variances, and there wasn't like a light meter. It was just a question of photographer's judgment. And at that point, a photographer probably had only been having their studio open for 2 years or 3 years. So the whole thing, even the portraiture, which again to us does look so stiff, even then it was really kind of like finger in the air trying to figure out what we're doing.
Wow. Oh, that's fascinating. And so going back, you mentioned what year did you say was sort of the accepted year of the first daguerreotype?
1839.
So 1839, we had our first kind of quote print, but cameras existed for a long time before that, right?
Sure. I mean, yeah, absolutely, in different formats. And, interestingly, talking about William Henry Fox Talbot, who, invented really what was the dominant process for so long, the negative positive process. He actually was spurred on, unlike Daguerre, who was an artist who wanted to try to capture a realistic scene. Talbot was spurred on by his inability to draw, and what he tried to use to help himself draw was something called a camera lucida, which is a little glass pyramid which you can use to sort of deflect or sort of send the image that you're looking at onto the paper, and you can sort of sketch it out.
Right.
But
Yeah.
in his case, it didn't work. He was still deeply disappointed by his efforts, and that was why he started experimenting with photography.
Oh, interesting. I mean, and you even to this day will see like muralists sometimes use a overhead projector or something to put the image up and then trace it out that way just to ensure that I guess the proportions are right and everything. So yeah, both old and new, but obviously I think artists and journalists are going to use whatever tools and tricks are available to them to I guess deliver the message or to create the impression that they have in their minds. And I love this concept going back to the very sort of first things we said, that photography from its earliest inception all the way until now has been simultaneously an attempt to reproduce reality with fidelity, but also an attempt to tell a story or to deliver a point of view in a deeply kind of creative and artistic way. Do you find that those things have they butted up against each other? Have they been in conflict, or have they always played nice?
No, they were hugely in conflict, and this I think as I mentioned earlier about the idea that photography was this seen as this sort of mechanical art, or the camera was this mechanical recording device. There was a huge tension there, and there was they used to have these international exhibitions where where people would come and display their photographs, and they would come and display new appliances or something. And there was a big commotion because I think it was in the early 1860s, photography was classified under as a mechanical object in this exhibition. And there were those that felt, no, it should be under the artistic field. It should be there with paintings and drawings. And so it was a huge conflict between the two. And, back to the point about photo manipulation for a minute, there was a photographer called Oscar Reigelander who really felt like photography should be used to create. And he had come from an artistic background. So he created an image that was what's called a composite image. It was multiple negatives he put together to create a scene, a kind of an allegorical scene of sort of virtue and vice. And so it was very much not producing reality. He was very much telling a story of the two paths you can take in life. And he was sharply criticized for it. There's some very devastating takedowns of him and his work in the journals
That's
at the time.
fascinating because they're like, you're tricking people? Like what were they
Well,
concerned about?
the thing was, he wasn't, because he was very open. He
Yeah,
didn't.
I
He
mean,
never
like,
said.
clearly this isn't a real photograph. It sounds to me like you're describing what I would envision as almost like a collage of different negatives kind of all stuck
Yes,
together. Okay,
exactly.
okay,
That's a
okay.
great way of this. Exactly, great way of putting it. It's almost like collage, and it took a lot of skill because he had to light them all in a way that made them look similar. He had to talk about perspective again. He had to make sure the foreground images weren't looking too big. So it took him a long time. It took him something like 6 weeks to do it. And at first, it was greeted with a lot of enthusiasm, and then there was this sort of backlash to it, saying this is not what we need to be using photography for. And one of the harshest criticisms of him and his work was that if he can do this with photography, he should really just pick up a paintbrush and do that instead, because it is so much a higher art than photography is. Art is. So there was this huge tension, and it went on for a long time. At the same time, there was a work, and you've probably seen it, it's very famous, by Henry Peach Robinson, called Fading Away, and it's again a composite image, I think, of 4 or 5 negatives of a young girl in the middle of the scene, sort of. She clearly has tuberculosis, and her family are sort of gathered around her. If you would look it up, you would definitely know it.
Yeah, I'm looking at it right now. Yeah. Oh, and I see the different, because obviously now there's a bunch of analysis of it. So I see the different pieces of it as well.
Exactly. And Robinson, firstly, he chose that subject matter because he thought it would be somewhat controversial for people to sort of be faced with this death scene. And secondly, he had this great quote that was like, he didn't want photography to be seen as a dull recorder of uninteresting facts. He really wanted to sort of push it in a new direction. But he was also criticized for what he did. He was criticized for, creating a scene in his backyard to make it look like the countryside. Both these artists, both Rejlander and Robinson, were criticized for taking photography beyond just reproducing reality and trying to reproduce something from their imaginations.
Mhm. And that criticism was that this is not the right usage of this medium, or you are trying to sort of mislead people, or I guess some combination of that?
I think some combination. I think really it's not the right usage. The thing that we can say about photography that is its highest virtue is one way somebody put it, I remember, is that, it is truth. It is photographic truth, which is, of course, like slightly absurd when you really just start to buckle into it because of everything we just talked about, because of perspective, because it lacked color. But nevertheless, there was this idea that you had to try to adhere to photographic truth. And if you were to create a scene like the ones we just talked about, it was somehow going against that sort of noble goal.
Yeah. How long, I mean, I guess this is a perspective question more than anything, but in your perspective, based on the scholarship and the literature, how long do you think that it took for, not for people to start pushing those boundaries, because clearly from day one, people were pushing the boundaries, but how long until it became an accepted, quote, art form and not just an attempt at like reproducing with fidelity kind of reality?
I think is that it had these two branches, right? Like in terms of photography coming from science, coming from chemistry, being used within science, like being used in astronomy, being used in photomicrography, being used with motion to try to understand how bodies move, and then also trying to explore it within the idea of creating an artwork. So the two sort of happened in parallel tracks and in different ways. Um, and I think what's interesting too is when you get to the end of the 19th century, when you get to the 1890s, you get this almost direct conflict between sort of facts and fiction and nonfiction, where you have the discovery of X-rays and X-ray imagery, and then the use of photography to photograph the paranormal. And these two things are happening literally in tandem at the same time. And the discovery of X-rays was really sort of galvanized those who felt like you could also photograph a thought, for example.
I love too that you actually use the word galvanized there because that's like quite it's actually quite funny when we think about like galvanism of the day. And it's, because there is and of course this is something that's fascinating to me as somebody who kind of identifies as a scientific skeptic, this lockstep movement of like science and pseudoscience throughout history, and how sometimes there is a demarcation problem. Sometimes things that we now see as pure pseudoscience were actually quite scientific based on what we knew. But then there was also always the snake oil salesman and always the pseudoscientific peddlers. And I'm reminded of a brilliant show that I feel like did not get enough love. Did you ever see The Nick? Did you ever watch that series?
No, I know, but
Oh,
I've read about it. Yes.
yeah, it's brilliant, 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 and it takes place during the same time, but it focuses on surgery, sort of just before the turn of the century. The hospital was just being electrified at this time. All these new inventions were coming up to, like, help pump blood or to help, reduce blood loss, or anesthesia wasn't really a big deal yet, and, like, it was just amazing to see, how barbaric things were and what was changing, and at the same time, snake oil was such a booming business. So and so's liniment and, it'll cure what ails you. And sometimes it was great because it was heroin or it was cocaine and it like felt great and it really worked to ease your pain. And other times it literally did nothing. It just did nothing. And they knew it did nothing, but they knew that they could make a quick buck off of gullible people. And so it is fascinating that push pull of like sort of the quote moral high ground versus the charlatanism, but like, who's in the right, who's in the no. Is it fair to say that this is somehow more appropriate or acceptable versus that, when everybody's kind of throwing darts at a dartboard, right?
And it was all influencing. That was so fascinating, reading about X-ray imagery and how it really influenced, because the ideas about, a sort of invisible, unseen force around our bodies that was not a new idea in the
Oh,
1890s.
miasma.
Yeah,
Yeah,
exactly.
that was old news.
Right. But this idea that, oh, well, hang on, we've just discovered these X-rays, and that's a kind of an invisible force. And wow, with X-rays we can take these amazing images. And so the theory was then, well, maybe there's other unseen rays that we've been sort of talking about for a while now. Maybe we can photograph those too. So there was this sort of like interplay between the two, which again
Right.
now we can look at and see it for what it is. But at the time,
Well, we
the
can,
ability
but
to
it also
suddenly,
doesn't die.
sorry.
I said we can, but I don't think it dies. There's still people go into quote haunted houses with these weird little e-meters and who go into, or whatever they call them, and people with Geiger counters trying to look at things that are paranormal and like, oh, maybe if I use this tool that can see the unseen, I'll see something that's actually metaphysical as well.
Yep, and they even sort of borrowed some of the language. I think there was one French photographer. Well, actually, he was a soldier, but he tried to use photography to photograph thoughts. And he even called the kind of rays that he was trying to capture, he called them V rays, meaning like vital fluid. The V was kind of standing for vital. So even the language like V rays, X rays was sort of borrowing from the X ray. But I guess when you think about it too, like imagine seeing an X ray for the first time, seeing through to a living human skeleton for the first time. If you were inclined to believe in mesmerism or V rays or any of the other things, it's not a huge leap.
No. And if you're a soldier and not a physicist or a chemist, and your, camera has a light leak in it, or there's, some other reason that there are artifacts in your, which of course there would be tons of artifacts because the glass wasn't perfectly clean and, all these different reasons. And now there's a halo around somebody's head, or there's like a little squiggle. And it's, ooh, of course they're going to say, is that a ghost? Is that, is that their thoughts leaving their minds? I mean, people do it to this day when they're trying to prove aliens or Bigfoot or, other kind of pseudoscientific bullshit. But back then, like, it may not have even felt like pseudoscience. It was all scientific inquiry, really.
I think certainly for the sphere that we're talking about now in relation to X-rays, so those that related to thought photography, dream photography, this idea of like this universal fluid being photographed. I think where the outright deliberate fraud comes in is with ghost or spirit photography.
Yeah, like all of the yeah. I can for a quick buck, I can get your dead grandma on the line. Yeah, and here's a
Yes.
photo of her. Yeah.
And this is certainly in Flashes of Brilliance in the chapter on trick or truth. Like, if the camera can only tell the truth, well, in that case, here is my portrait, and next to me is this deceased person that I once knew. Well, the camera cannot lie, so this must be true. Whereas, it really was, there were photographers who were either double exposing their plates or figuring out other ways in which to dupe people into thinking they had a spirit photograph.
Absolutely. I'm curious, we've talked a little bit about sort of the medical or the scientific uses. Obviously, we didn't cover them all, but we've touched on things like X-rays or photomicrography. One thing that you mentioned very quickly in passing, and that you dedicate some time in the book to, you've got your chapter on running, jumping, galloping. I'm curious, you could have very easily said, I am going to write a book about early photography, and I'm going to stick with still photographs in still usage. But talk to me about motion. Talk to me about how that came to be and how you decided to kind of approach writing about it.
Oh, I just kind of love the stories around motion. I really do. And the key figures. I mean, look, photography. The problem with photography is always obviously that the subject had to be static. Even when exposure times began to get faster, you still had to have a static subject. And
Yeah, I
then
mean, even today, you have to have I mean, yes, you can have a very, very fast, shutter speed, but like even on your iPhone, you'd have to change it to a certain setting if you want to capture a still of somebody running past you. Otherwise, it's going to be a big blur.
right. And what I love about Muybridge and Mary, who are the two main characters. We have Edward Muybridge, who's very well known. He did the horse trotting experiment, which I think a lot of people know. And then Etienne Jules Mary, who was a French doctor, who really just wanted to understand how the human body moved, how animal bodies move in space. So between the two of them, they had these very different techniques that just, again, kind of coalesced together at the same time as some other people were experimenting with fast-moving imagery. And ultimately, it went on to create movies. I mean, it's just extraordinary to me that there's an entirely new art form that came from photography. And in doing the research on Muybridge and Mary, it really made me realize or remember, or appreciate, maybe is the best way to put it, maybe appreciate the close connection between the two. And what's also interesting to me is this, it's not only to do with photography, but also to do with various devices that existed in the 19th century.
Yeah, I was going to ask about that because you have to, it's not just with the image, it's how you observe motion through of the images. So I just looked up Muybridge because, of course, I was like, yeah, I want to see the horses. And I remember like the spinny thingy, which I'm sure has a name.
Well, you know what? I would prefer to call it a spinny thingy.
Okay, we'll stick with that.
He called it a zoopraxiscope.
Oh, but I love that too.
I mean,
is that because he was only looking at animals through it? Like, come on, man, let's get creative.
I know. It's such a mouthful. Well, it was based on a zoetrope, right? So this idea that you had this spinning drum with these sort of slots, right? And so if you put an image behind the slot and you spun it through persistence vision, it would look as though the horse was leaping or the person was running or whatever it was. And so then he adapted it to call this spinny thingy, aka the zoopraxiscope.
Okay.
And what he did was he kind of married the zoetrope with a sort of a magic lantern, which was basically a projector, right? The projector that then we're in business, because then not only did he have his individual frames of the horse, that every fraction of a second of a horse lifting up its feet in its run or its gallop, he was then able to paint that onto a disc, put the disc in the zoopraxiscope, project it onto a wall with limelight, and lo and behold, you have motion, or you have what appears to be motion.
Yeah, like you're literally watching a little movie on a wall.
Well, I was going to say, it's just a fabulous quote of a journalist who went to go and witness this in San Francisco, I think, when he first showed it, or one of the first times he showed it. And the journalist said something like the only thing that was missing was that of the stomping of the hooves and the sound of the horse snorting. I mean, that was how realistic it felt to the audience.
Oh, I love that. And then enter Foley sound. not too long after. And
someone
you're
with some coconut shells.
Some coconuts. But what's funny is I'm sitting here, I Google, the Muybridge horse, and I click images, and I see all of these images of the still frames, and I see images of the zoopraxiscope and everything. But then I also, a few lines down, see a for sale in some museum bookstore, a flip book. And I'm like, well, duh, a flip book. Like, what a simple way to approximate movement just by flipping through the frames in a bound. Like, that must have come. Was that a new invention? Okay, that did come earlier.
That was, I think, 1860s from memory. But yes, and there were other devices too, the names of which I'd have to look up, but there are other devices too at the time, that all of which kind of play with the same idea of persistence vision, whereby, a very fast moving image sort of registers on your brain, and then you just it appears as though it's in motion. And so that was sort of the jumping off point for Muybridge. And then for Mary, he had a slightly different approach. So instead of these individual frames that Muybridge did, Mary actually tried to get a photograph of someone moving in space on a single plate. So tiny incremental motions on one plate. So it sort of looks like a stick figure, basically, kind of moving through space. And that was for him a more measurable way, because he was a scientist. Muybridge was not a scientist, he was a photographer. It was a more measurable way for Mary to figure out the joints and the movements of humans and animals.
And what about the earliest, like I have a friend, and I'm blanking on the name, but he collects, and he has a camera that takes the sort of binocular photos, like the side-by-side photos, and then you look through the little scope to see them in 3D.
Mm-hmm, the stereoscope.
Stereoscope, of course,
yes.
The stereoscope. When did that sort of idea of three-dimensional photography first kind of come on the scene?
Well, my gosh, I'm so glad you asked about that because it really ties in nicely to this idea of motion and about how it wasn't just the photos, it was also the device you could use to make them appear to move. So part of there's one chapter in Flashes of Brilliance that looks at lunar photography. Yeah, this attempts to try to photograph the moon.
Oh, yeah, which is, as we all know who have iPhones, it's very hard to do.
Very hard to
To not
do.
just have a
I've tried
blurry,
it.
bright spot, yeah.
I've tried it through a telescope and it's hard to do.
Yeah, same, same.
And one of the individuals in this chapter, he really wanted his images of the moon to seem as three-dimensional and as real as possible. He didn't want it to look flat. He wanted it to look round and spherical and rotund and like it had weight and form. And so he actually leaned on the stereoscope, which came in the 1850s.
Oh, so even before a photograph, we had the actual stereoscope.
No, I think because stereoscope, I think was the
Oh,
1850s,
did you
and
say
yeah,
30s before? God, I'm not
that's okay. No. But it was all around. I mean, and this reminds me of a quote from, I think, Emerson saying, like, our age is ocular of the 19th century. Everything was to do with vision. You had all these devices like the zoetrope that would move things. You had the stereoscope. People had stereoscopes in their living rooms so they could look through them and see a three-dimensional scene. And so Warren de la Rue, who was this English businessman and amateur astronomer, took images of the moon successfully in the late 1850s and started distributing them as stereoscope views. And the idea was to make the moon appear like a sphere, make it look like a three-dimensional view, really try to bring its form and shape. Now, part of his impetus for this was to help with mapping the moon, which was a very time-consuming process. But also, the net effect was also that people could then just look at the moon in their own living rooms in the middle of the day if they wanted to.
Yeah, and I think understanding, because we could look up, and with good, lenses, you can see a lot of these relief features on the moon. We were already understanding that it was more than just like a shiny dot in the sky, but to be able to see detail, I mean, that's quite arresting for an individual who doesn't have access to any of that sort of scientific technology.
Absolutely. I mean, yeah, hugely arresting. And I think it was seen that way. There's sort of letters into the photographic journals where people were praising his work by saying it's an extraordinary detailed view, and it really brought it into focus properly for people.
Yeah, 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 I can imagine. And so, and now, I don't know, I guess stereoscopes now, because we have like, it's, I don't, I actually don't know where I'm going with this. Like, do we have a better or an easier time at seeing in three dimensions? Obviously, we have 3D films and we have all of these really, really sophisticated ways of seeing it. So stereoscopes now, they're a bit like kitschy. They're a bit of like a collector's, item, but they're still effective. And I find that, like, when people see them for the first time, they're like, "This is awesome."
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, really, truly. And you have to imagine too that in the 1850s, when people were seeing them, they
Yeah.
that was not a point at which people were seeing photographs in newspapers, right? Because
Oh,
there wasn't yet
wow.
the ability to actually reproduce a photo. So yes, you could see an engraving based on a photograph if you were to open a newspaper or a journal,
Oh, but you
but to
couldn't print
actually
photos.
no. So if you saw a photograph in the 1850s, you were either going to a gallery or you went to a photographer to get your own portrait taken. So there wasn't until the stereoscope and people had these stereoscope views in their homes, the proliferation of photography was much much smaller. And so yeah, the stereoscope is amazing even to us, and we're in a very image saturated time. So you can only imagine what it was like to someone in the 1850s.
Oh, wow, that's really neat. I So was this like, okay, I'm a little confused as to whether, and I think about any, again, modern technology, and it's sometimes hard for us. We talk a lot about being anthropocentric in sort of ecology and evolutionary biology and zoology, but being sort of modern centric in historical situations, right? We think about new technology today, an iPhone, CRISPR, whatever, and we're situated in today. And then we often look back in time and assume that the reactions to things were exactly how they are today. So when we look back at early photography, whether we're talking about the devices themselves, the cameras or the prints or whatever, at what point did it become democratized? Or at what point could an everyday person afford to engage with photography? Or was it sort of like a rich people's game for a while?
I mean, initially it certainly was because you needed to not only afford the equipment, but also, have the ability to read the manuals to sort of understand how to create a photograph. So really, as we were talking earlier, in the very late 1870s, this new process came along, this dry plate process, which meant you could just purchase film that was already prepared. And that made things much easier. And from there on, you had this huge boom in amateur photography. I mean, you still needed to be able to, afford a camera, but it certainly went a long ways toward making it more democratized. And then, of course, in 1888, you had the Kodak. The very first Kodak camera comes out from George Eastman. And this was the first camera whereby you talk about being in the 90s and dropping off your film at the chemist. This was when you would get your camera, take your photographs, and then you would send the film back to Kodak to develop it, and they would send you your prints and a completely newly reloaded camera. So
So
this was
Kodak
this.
was like the first kind of Apple ecosystem where it was like, you got to buy our thing and our thing, and it only works with our thing,
I
but it
mean,
works
that's
really well. Yeah.
a great point. Yeah.
Okay.
But
All right.
again, you still had to be able to afford to get the camera. But for somebody who had a little bit of disposable income, who was interested in becoming an amateur photographer, that was a way to do it where you didn't really have to mess around with chemicals or a darkroom. And at that time, there was a huge, huge increase in amateur clubs and societies. The Amateur Photographer magazine started publishing in the UK. It's still in print today. And that was all about going on holiday to France and taking photographs, or the best way to, all the sort of things that might concern an amateur photographer was documented in that magazine.
So I still feel like there was probably maybe it wasn't like a rich and poor divide, but definitely a middle class and poverty divide. Like I'm assuming that's, I mean, to this day, that's the case, right? That,
Yes, I think so.
um, yeah. But things have become sort of accessible in a way that most everybody, I've traveled the world. I've been to every continent except for Antarctica. I've been to many countries, and in even the most impoverished areas of the world, everybody has a cell phone. It's just a very common thing to have in your hand. And so most people have access to a camera, whether they have enough storage to save a lot of photos on their phone or whether, whatever, those things are different. But I can imagine that it took quite some time for a lower, a working class individual or somebody who didn't have disposable income to be engaged with photography in a meaningful way.
And I think it was also when there was this huge influx of amateur photographers and this huge influx and this huge interest in this new camera design, there was a kind of a flip side to that, which was that actually there was this great phrase that came about. It was a camera fiend. And this was a person who took photos of someone candidly that were kind of embarrassing. One of the examples is, somebody took a photo of a duchess eating a pear. This was this kind of embarrassing thing. You wouldn't want to take a photograph of somebody eating a pear. The same way there was a photograph of Queen Victoria laughing, which was seen as being very improper. And so even though amateurs proliferated and it was a huge boon, there was certainly an element of some amateurs that was frowned upon because their behavior was seen as rude or embarrassing or unflattering.
And I can't help but also wonder about, one of the themes that's been coming up time and time again on both this show on Talk Nerdy, but also I've been bringing it up quite a bit lately on another show I work on, The Skeptic's Guide to the Universe, is this concept of the emic versus the etic perspective in like sociology and anthropology, and this idea of sort of early sociological and anthropological writings and scholarship being very, very etic, right? Like I am a sort of semi-wealthy or learned, white Westerner, and I'm going to go into a culture and I'm going to take from it and then tell a story back to my people about these, whatever, noble savages or all, it was so racist and it was so colonial. And then this movement into, the insider's perspective. I am of this culture and I'm going to tell the story of my people. That photography must have had, and still kind of still does, but at least early on at the time, an overt sort of etic perspective. Like, I have camera, I will go to the wilderness, I will go to these untouched places and take pictures of these people no one has ever seen.
Yeah, I think that is certainly true. I mean, I don't touch on travel photography as such in this book, but yes, I mean certainly it was like a tool to take and to use it to sort of document or record. There was certainly an interesting instance of the involvement of women in photography that I talk about in the book, in respect of, in the earliest days, the daguerreotype being suitable for women of leisure who had money and education, and they could take photographs and enjoy it as their sort of pastime. But actually, the reality was that women also worked as photographers. They were also portrait photographers from early on in England, from the sort of 1840s. And I think that is certainly something that has only come into scholarship in recent decades.
People have been in the know of, especially women, have been in the know about this since women had cameras in their hands. It's funny you bring that up, because I was just on a plane coming back from New York for a conference this weekend, and I watched the film Lee with Kate
Mm-hmm.
Winslet.
Mm-hmm.
And she was, the war photographer during
Mm-hmm.
World War
Mm-hmm.
II.
Yeah,
And
Lee Miller.
yeah, and there's the scene where she brings, she worked for Vogue. She was a model before that, and she brings back, her images to her editor, and they're like, only a woman could have taken these photos. Only a
Mm-hmm.
woman. Like, there's just this understanding that this was through the female gaze and not the typical male gaze that is what every photograph of war had been of, up to that point. And it's fascinating, this idea that the user, obviously we know this, right? The artist, the journalist, the whatever, the user, it's their perspective that's coming through the images. But something as fundamental as gender can wildly change not just the subject matter, but how it's composed, what emotion comes through, what story is trying to be told. And of course, we know that's the case with race and ethnicity and, every kind of aspect of intersectionality.
And certainly in the book, in the chapter on candid photography, I talk about Alice Austin, who's a well-known photographer now, but at the time, she was an amateur. She lived in Staten Island, but what's extraordinary about her archive, which was nearly lost, is that she took all these images of her and her friends, and these really candid scenes that I still feel quite rare to look at, because at that time, the idea you have of Victorian womanhood is quite sort of formal, perhaps, and she's there with her friends, and they're dressed up as men, or they're pretending to smoke cigarettes, and it's this sort of wonderful glimpse, this very intimate glimpse into her life and to her friendships.
Oh, I love that. This sort of verite, like this deeply authentic and almost like unsuspecting capture, which to this day, those are my favorite photographs,
Oh yeah,
right?
I
To this
know.
day, there's just something in that moment in time that the second somebody is aware that they're being watched, they lose something in themselves. They
Hmm.
lose that authenticity.
Hmm. Yeah.
And now we're so self-referential. We are so, once we figured out how to mount the camera to the front of the phone, like, and that's not to say that early photographers weren't doing self-portraiture. Of course they were, but it was often a bit clunky and a bit, like it had to be very set up. But as soon as anybody on the street could go like me, I can be my own subject matter. Here we go.
Yeah.
Then it's like, what percentage of the pictures in your camera reel are either your pet, your child, or your face?
Yeah. Yep. And the other great thing about when there was these sort of boom in amateurs was oftentimes when the photographer did have a hidden camera, or a camera that was more difficult to see, that's really when you do get, again, those really candid photographs, those street scenes, for example, that just make the whole period seem to come to life in a completely different way than a more formal portrait does.
Absolutely. So I'm curious. We're pretty much out of time, but I'm going to say we're
Mm.
running low on time because this is fascinating. I could talk to you for hours. I won't do it. I promise. Um, one of the things, there's always kind of this question when I talk to authors about how to tell stories about history, and sometimes it's chronological, sometimes it's thematic, sometimes it's like there's these different approaches. We mentioned inflection points. And that's not to say that that's how your book is organized, because your book is a little bit more thematic, right? Like,
Yep.
yeah, yeah, yeah. But we mentioned these inflection points. The first one being like you could print something on metal, right? You could take the thing that was just on the wall, and now you can print it and hold it in your hand. Then there was this massive inflection point where there's film, right? There's like this pre sort of painted film, and now you could take it with you. What would you consider sort of the main inflection points in photography that really changed the game?
I mean, I suppose if we're talking about processes, it certainly has to be. I mean, there's sort of two really. If we talk about processes, I would say, there was the wet collodion process that came in the early 1850s, and it was that enabled sort of tin types to be made and amber types to be made. And then there was the dry gelatin process, which I've talked about as really driving the changes in camera design and really leading to this boom in amateur photography. So from like a process chemistry perspective, obviously including the actual introduction of the daguerreotype, those would be the two. But I think it's also really interesting to consider there being kind of a lot of mini inflection points in terms of the innovations that took place in photography. So if we think about it as being kind of incremental steps to going to create something. So if I think about, let's say, artificial light, if you think about photography, the necessity for photography is light. And yet photography came into being at a time when there was not yet electricity, lights. This was a time of where things were pretty dark unless you had lanterns and lamps and gas lights. So there were these incremental tiny steps that were taken in order to try to get to a point in which you had reliable artificial light for photography. And each of them kind of contributed their own step toward that leap that ultimately meant that photographers did have a flashlight.
Yeah. Oh, and it makes you wonder too how much. I mean, this may be an unanswerable question, but I often think about the types of technologies that come out of like the hunger for space travel, for example. Like we really want to do this, so we need to solve this problem and solve that problem. And in it, all these technologies come out that change the game for these wildly disparate fields. So it's like I desperately want to take a photograph. I need a flashbulb for that. What other uses were like, oh, I cannot believe we didn't have this before for this other reason.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, limelight is a great example. Limelight was something that the photographers tried to use in the early years for lighting images, and it didn't work for various reasons. But instead, it started to get used on stage, and that's why you now say someone's in the limelight because it was used in the theater. I mean, it's this like strange parallels that sort of come through history. That was really what I found researching this is not only did oftentimes several people come up with sort of a similar idea in a different way, but also that all these incremental steps and moments, they all led to something. And that one thing that changed it, that one inflection point could not have really happened without these other small, tiny steps.
I love that. And then what about, I mean, obviously you're focusing on the genius of early photography here, but I can imagine that transition from analog to digital really changed everything as well.
Oh, I mean, yes, without a question. I find that to be when you look at the volume. I mean, I read recently that I think on Instagram there's something like 95 million images shared per day,
Oh my God. Yeah, it's
and
just
so when just that is sort of like an unfathomable number to me, especially when I've been spending the last sort of 7 years or so in the 19th century.
right, right. Oh, it's incredible. And it, it's like obviously we can sit here and pontificate about the moral implications or the outcomes of like the flood versus the I don't know, the earliest work, which was very what's the word I'm looking for? There were barriers to entry, right? And so it was only specific people and specific points of view that even were able to share, to speak through photography. Now it's anybody and everybody, but with that also comes just like this fire hose. And it's sort of six and one, half a dozen the other, right? Like democratizing something is, I think, fundamentally a good thing. And then at the same time, when you get so flooded with content, everything gets lost. And that's really tough.
Without question, and I think it's only a good thing that we can have phones now that can document things and take photographs. And I think one of the things I would love for if people read the book, one thing I'd love for them to take away is just a sort of newfound appreciation of how kind of magical really taking a photograph is. We all have it in our pockets and we can all do it, and I think that is absolutely fabulous, and I love it. I love that people take photographs all the time. I have something like 15,000 photos in my own phone, and also I think it's to appreciate just how far it's come and how difficult it was at one point, but that I think it's all been part of this same desire to try to sort of freeze a moment in time.
Absolutely, and that I guess that is one concept that we didn't really delve too much into, so maybe we can close on that. I mean, obviously, there's 1,000 things that can be said, but also you may have said it all in that one sentence that we are desperate to freeze time. We are desperate to capture to the extent now, and we've all seen this, right? You go to a concert, you go on vacation, you go someplace where there's smells and sounds, and it's like a multi-sensory experience, and yet people aren't just experiencing it. They're looking at it through the glass of their phone, and they're just like trying to capture it so that they can then live it later, but you don't live it later. It's not the same.
Yeah, it's almost like you have to be conscious of, yes, you want to take the photo and record it, but you also just got to put it away and then just be present and be in it. And I read this it's funny, I read an interview recently with Robert Doisneau, the very famous French photographer. He took that image of the couple kissing outside the Hotel de Ville. And he was writing about photography, and he quoted a poem where he said, taking a photograph or having a photograph is like capturing a small second of eternity. That was the sort of quote from the poem, which I thought was such a lovely and sort of romantic way of putting it. It's a small second of eternity. And that it does enable you to do it. You take that small second of eternity, and then, if it's your phone, you can put your phone away and then just still be in it.
And hopefully you do. And I guess not to sound like I'm advocating for the opposite of everything we've been talking about for the last hour, but I have this like distinct memory of observing a total solar eclipse and making a conscious decision to say, somebody else is going to take the quintessential photograph of this. Like, I will be able to experience this through its stunning beauty on the internet tomorrow with people who are much more skilled than I am, who have more technique, who have more, better equipment. I do not want to waste these precious minutes of like literal ecstasy, like, and otherworldliness. It's the closest you can feel to being on drugs without taking anything mind altering by trying to look at it through my phone.
Yeah, it's a balance between like I said, a real conscientiousness to appreciate the moment, to take the photo you want to take, and then just be in it.
Right, right. And I think that we're probably all striving to find that better balance. I can imagine that professional photographers who spend all day, every day behind a lens, they have a certain perspective and they have both experienced things we would never be able to experience because the nature of the job took them places we could never go, but also had maybe some moments of feeling like they weren't in it because they were working and because they were trying to capture whatever it is. And I think we've all now experienced that to an extent, and we have to be so careful not to be, I guess, our lives be dictated by that.
Yes, I mean, I guess that was the advantage. If it took you, 15 minutes to set up a single frame in your camera before,
Right.
back in the 19th century, you did you had to then be present.
Absolutely. Oh gosh. There's so much more. Obviously, there's so much in your book that we didn't touch on. But how do you feel, Anika? Is there anything that like, oh gosh, we didn't even mention that this chapter exists or that this section of the book like definitely needs reference?
I think we've covered really nicely what I think what the book is about, which is these innovative practices and how it changed photography. This sort of tension/relationship between art and science, and the real sort of curiosity and ingenuity that went into all of these developments in photography. And I guess the only other thing I would highlight is some of these were not successful; they were total failures, and that's also okay.
Right, right, and that's how we are where we are now, obviously. We have to fail in order to succeed. Um, I can't thank you enough. I mean, it's absolutely fascinating. When the book came across my desk, I was like, "Yes, yes, yes, we have to book this. This is so interesting." It's a bit out of step for what we usually talk about on the show, but it's such a perfect fit. I think you just have a unique perspective, so you wrote a unique book, and, at this point, I've been doing this for a long time. That's rare. And so I'm super appreciative of your perspective, of the stories that you share, and of taking the time out of your schedule to spend time with us today.
Thank you so much. I've enjoyed talking to you so much. It's been great.
Oh, I'm so glad. Everybody, the book is Flashes of Brilliance, The Genius of Early Photography and How It Transformed Art, Science, and History by Anika Burgess. And everybody listening, thank you for coming back week after week. I'm really looking forward to the next time we all get together to talk nerdy.